Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the Mount Washington, Kentucky scam phone call case? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, consider supporting me on Patreon, and check out my podcast, Bella Grande Media. I will put the relevant links to those items in the description for this video. This case involves a string of phone calls made by an individual pretending to be a police officer who ordered the people who answered the phone to commit various crimes. The most famous scam was one based on a call to a McDonald's restaurant in Mount Washington, Kentucky. First, I'll look at the scam phone calls in general, then specifically discuss the Mount Washington case, which involved Donna Summers and Louise Ogborn, talk about the case against David Stewart, and then offer my analysis. Starting with the scam calls in general. Starting in 1992, various businesses across the United States started receiving calls from a man claiming to be a police officer. Most of the businesses were restaurants, like McDonald's, Applebee's, or Taco Bell. There were other businesses as well, like a Winn-Dixie grocery store. There were some variations in the scam, but here is basically how it functioned. The police impersonator would call and ask for a manager or supervisor. Sometimes the impersonator would pretend that he was on the phone with a high-level manager from that restaurant, like the person was on the phone with him, like a conference call. He would ask the manager or supervisor with their assistance in detaining a female employee or customer who he claimed was a suspect in a criminal investigation. He would provide the manager a description of the woman. Then the manager would go get that person, like call her into an office. The police impersonator would then ask the manager to search the woman, which would include instructing the woman to remove her clothing. There were about 70 of these incidents. Several resulted in civil lawsuits filed by the victims. Now moving to the Mount Washington, Kentucky case. This was by far the most notorious of these fraudulent phone calls. It lasted the longest and involved the most people. It occurred on April 9, 2004, at about 4 p.m., when a man calling himself Officer Scott called a McDonald's restaurant in Mount Washington, Kentucky. This is just south of Louisville. The assistant manager who the man reached at the restaurant was named Donna Jean Summers. The caller told Summers that he was on the phone with a high-level McDonald's manager. The man suspected one of the female employees of stealing a woman's purse and being a drug dealer. Because these were minor offenses, the police really didn't have time to investigate. He was hoping that Summers could search the woman, or else the suspect would have to be arrested by the police. So he was trying to make it seem as though the manager he was talking to could actually help the suspect, so it wouldn't necessarily have to involve law enforcement. After the man described a young white woman with blonde hair, Summers felt as though the description matched an 18-year-old employee named Louise Ogborn, who was currently working her second shift for that day. She had worked a shift earlier and stayed for another shift after somebody called out. Following the instructions of the police impersonator, Summers brought Ogborn to the management office. She ordered her to take off her clothing, which Ogborn did. Summers put the clothes in a bag and took them to her car. Again, this is what Officer Scott was demanding. Ogborn covered herself with an apron, so that's all she had on in this office. Another assistant manager was brought in to witness the search. She left after about an hour because her shift was over. The phone call with the impersonator was still going on. Summers told the man that she needed to get to work. The man told Summers to find someone she trusted to continue this investigation. So Summers really believed what she was doing rose to the level of an investigation. Summers asked one of the cooks to fill in, a man named Jason Bradley. Bradley started talking to the impersonator, so he got on the phone with the man. The man ordered him to remove the apron that Ogborn was wearing and describe her. Bradley said he would not do that. The man then asked Summers if she was married. She said that she had a fiancé named Walter Wes Nix Jr. Summers called Walter Nix, who drove into the restaurant to take over this investigation. So she had the ability to call Walter Nix, but she never called to check and see if this was an actual police officer. Over the next 2 hours, Walter Nix talked to the police impersonator and followed his instructions. This involved having Ogborn remove the apron, perform jumping jacks and dance, receive a spanking from Walter Nix, and perform various sexual acts. Walter Nix complied with all these requests, committing several crimes in the process. Walter Nix needed to leave for work, which the fake police officer permitted as long as Summers could find a replacement, again to continue this so-called investigation. Summers selected the maintenance man from the restaurant, Thomas Sims. He was not working. He just stopped in to get dessert and coffee. When Sims started talking to the impersonator, he immediately refused to comply. It was at this point when Summers claimed she first became suspicious. Summers decided to call that high-level manager, who the police impersonator said was on the line. The manager said she had never spoken to any police officer. She had been asleep. The police impersonator ended the call. Summers apologized to the victim. Ogborn had been in that office for 3.5 hours. The actual police responded to the restaurant. They arrived there within 5 minutes. They arrested Walter Nix and eventually arrested Donna Summers. Walter Nix pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Donna Summers was allowed to enter an Alford plea to a single count of unlawful imprisonment. This meant that she was admitting the state had enough evidence to prosecute her, but she was still maintaining her innocence. She was sentenced to a year of probation. Both Summers and Ogborn sued McDonald's. Summers was awarded $1.1 million, but on appeal it was reduced to $400,000. Ogborn was awarded $6.1 million. McDonald's appealed. She settled with them for $1.1 million. Moving back to the police investigation, the investigation revealed that the call made to the Mount Washington McDonald's came from a payphone at a supermarket in Panama City, Florida. This brings me to the case against David Stewart. The police were able to determine that the caller used a phone card that was purchased from a Walmart in Panama City. They tracked down the actual transaction, but the cameras did not capture a good image of whoever made the purchase. They could make out some details, but not everything. They were able to see that the individual was wearing a uniform similar to one worn by employees of a company called Corrections Corporation of America. This is a private security firm. Eventually, the police were able to narrow down the suspects and identify a man named David Richard Stewart. He was a corrections officer. He had volunteered as a deputy in a small police department in Florida and had attended a local police academy. He was questioned by the police. He said he never bought a phone card. The police searched his residence and found a few interesting items: hundreds of police magazines, police-style uniforms, police paraphernalia and training manuals, dozens of applications for jobs in police departments, and a phone card which had been used to call 9 restaurants in the past year. The card had been used to call a Burger King in Idaho Falls, Idaho, on the same day when a scam was reported by the manager of that restaurant. Stewart was arrested and extradited to Kentucky. Stewart's attorney argued that his client simply was not persuasive or eloquent enough to convince somebody like the impersonator did, so he wasn't as manipulative and capable as whoever really did it was. In the fall of 2006, he was tried and found not guilty on all charges, so he was acquitted. The prosecution maintains that Stewart was the perpetrator, but they struggled to identify direct evidence against him. The call wasn't recorded, therefore no one could see if his voice really matched the caller. Stewart remains a suspect in the remaining scam calls. After his arrest, no more scam calls were reported. Now moving to my analysis of the Mount Washington incident. This case has a lot of components to it. A convincing police impersonator, gullible restaurant employees who committed crimes, skeptical restaurant workers who would not comply but also didn't call the police, and a victim who some have said, including McDonald's during the lawsuit, should have had the common sense to exit the situation. This case explores the limits of gullibility as far as a criminal defense. Let's take a look at the various components. As far as the police impersonator, whoever it was, the individual was persuasive. He used police terminology. He spoke with authority. He was able to manipulate his targets quite readily. As far as a profile for this individual, he was probably sadistic, angry, assertive, dominant, and grandiose. His behavior was consistent with having fantasies of being a police officer. Moving to the gullible restaurant workers, starting with Walter Nix, his defense was that he was being ordered by someone he believed to be a police officer. This, of course, is insufficient to explain his extreme behavior. It may have been that he was suspicious, but also enjoyed the feeling of power that he obtained from harming Ogborn. Like in a way, he was joining with the caller. They were in it together. Not something they planned in advance, because it's likely that Walter Nix didn't even know the perpetrator, but a relationship that formed during the call. They were on the same wavelength. During court proceedings, Walter Nix would say that the caller had control of his mind. I can picture Walter saying to this caller, "Oh, you want to control my mind? Go ahead. I don't use it anyway." Moving to Donna Summers, I think a lot of people look at this case and simply wonder what she was thinking. Why didn't she just call the police and ask them if Officer Scott was a real police officer? How come she didn't understand the police were limited in what type of orders they can issue? There was this interview where Summers just kept repeating that she believed the caller was a police officer. Like this excused all of her egregious behavior. She did not accept any responsibility for what she did. Like when somebody says they're an officer, that's it. Thinking stops. Moral obligations are terminated. Summers was in the unusual position of committing a crime and winning a civil lawsuit against her employer. She violated the policies of McDonald's. They did not allow searches, and they did not allow non-employees in the office. Yet somehow they were found partially responsible for her behavior. The paradox that occurs with people like Walter Nix and Donna Summers is how a person in this situation can be so high in agreeableness that they can fall for the scam, and yet be so low in agreeableness that they can become perpetrators themselves. Can gullibility be so pronounced that a person is a danger to society? This is really the problem for all of the gullible restaurant workers who ended up committing offenses across these many scams, not just those in Kentucky. Now, looking at these skeptical workers, there's not much to say here except they were disagreeable enough to refrain from committing a crime, so that was good, but not disagreeable enough to call the police. It's like they just wanted to stay neutral. This brings me to the victim, Louise Ogborn. Even though most people agree that she was a victim in the situation, some people still wonder why she simply did not refuse to comply. During an interview that she gave, she said that she was taught to respect authority. It sounds like it never occurred to her to challenge what an adult was saying. Considering her age and other circumstances, I'm not surprised that she complied with the various requests. She was embarrassed, her keys had been taken, she wasn't wearing clothes. Summers created a situation where Ogborn did not have a way to escape that would not cause further humiliation. As far as the argument in the civil suit suggesting that Ogborn's behavior was contrary to common sense, it did seem like it was, but that doesn't mean she was not a victim. It would seem that few people in that restaurant had common sense. It was like a common sense black hole from which bad decision-making, nonsensical thought, and poor critical thinking skills could never escape. What can we learn from this case? Between 1961 and 1965, a researcher named Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments at Yale University. These involved participants who believed they were administering progressively more painful electric shocks to other people. They weren't really, but they believed they were. The experiment was studying obedience to authority. The results were horrifying. Most of the participants were willing to cause what they believed to be significant harm. Studies like this have led to many theories about the nature of obedience to authority. One, people have learned to trust authority figures. They realize that just because they don't understand something experts say, it doesn't mean the experts are wrong. Some behaviors can feel wrong, but technically be warranted. Two, people can be afraid of the consequences for not following the directions of authority figures. Like maybe the restaurant workers thought that they would be arrested if they did not comply. Three, people sometimes view themselves as an instrument for carrying out the desires of another. Therefore, they don't view themselves as responsible. They just become an extension for authority figures. It's almost like their agency is gone. 4. There is a utility to agreeableness, meaning sometimes it's good to cooperate and to trust. Extremely agreeable people are often successful, even though they are less likely to pave their own way. Their successes come about because they follow someone else who's disagreeable. Being disagreeable only works in certain circumstances. Agreeableness works in a wider range of situations. Like in many employment situations, agreeableness would be favorable. Perhaps people sometimes obey authority simply because agreeableness was beneficial to them most of the time. Like that's the habit that they're in. They're used to following instructions. 5. Authority figures can unlock a criminal propensity that was already there, meaning people follow the authority figure because doing so allows them to explore and fulfill their own dark desires. Whatever the reasons for obedience to authority, this case is a reminder that it's important to challenge authority, especially if some type of harm is being perpetrated. This whole situation could have been prevented simply by verifying the authority was real. It was really just common sense. It wasn't necessarily even about obedience to authority. It was about basic verification processes. Before someone chooses to obey an authority, they need to make sure that the authority is genuine. This may have been a case where obedience to authority combined with extreme gullibility to create a dangerous circumstance. Obedience to authority is sometimes useful, but it always needs to have a limit. Those are my thoughts on the case of the scam calls made to the McDonald's restaurant in Kentucky. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.